Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today, for tuning in for this short presentation and video about my research, the progress of my research in complex project governance, and the preliminary findings from my systematic literature review. Before I start, I'd like to acknowledge the land that I stand on today is the land of the Ghana people, and I pay my respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging. So for those who haven't met me before, my name is John Khatib, and I'm doing my PhD in complex project governance with focus on complex project in a diverse range of industries, including defense, digital transformation, large-scale digital transformation, sustainability projects, and other sort of complex projects. Today, my intention is to share the progress that I make throughout this journey, this exciting journey, I would say. As some of you might know, I'm doing my PhD at the University of Adelaide, where I'm supported by many of the staff, including my kind supervisors, Dr. Richa Gulati and Associate Professor Indra Gunawan. So thank you so much for their support. So as I said, this presentation is mainly to provide an update about where my research is coming from, share some insights about the system from the systematic literature review, and just get some address some of the important issues that we find very important to share with the researchers and practitioners. Just quick introduction about myself. So as I said, John Khatib. So I've been in the management consultancy and project management business for the last 20 years. I came to my PhD journey after spending quite a long time managing projects and working in a diverse range of industries. I started my career back in the time in 2000, almost 2004, 2005 in industrial engineering, and I moved to other industries, including consulting and training, community service, health, software development. So from my perspective, I think this gave me a broad understanding about what is project management, how the project management is different to different audience and different cohorts and different industries and contexts. While most of these industries share the same, can benefit from the same generic project management methodology or application, there are very fascinating aspects to each industry that makes us, as practitioners, stop and think about it from a practical perspective. I'm doing my PhD in complex project governance, as I mentioned, at the University of Adelaide, and you can reach me by using any of those contact details. In terms of education, just quickly, in terms of experience, as I said, 20 years of experience in project management and management consulting. The last 10 years was mainly my own business, specialized in assisting small to medium-sized businesses to apply best practices across the board, from change management to project management to business consulting to streamline the business processes, improving efficiency and effectiveness of their assets. Extensive experience across multiple industries, as I said, which gave me a broad understanding about and a very interesting insights about each of these industries. At the same time, I'm heavily involved with PMI, Project Management Institute in Pennsylvania, United States. As part of my engagement with them, I'm an authorized training partner, authorized trainer, as part of their new ATP or Authorized Training Partner Program. I'm specialized in delivering PMP, Project Management Professional, Agile Certified Practitioner, and CAPM Certified Associate in Project Management. Quickly, my education and professional credentials. I've spent many years of my life studying and engaged in professional development, which I think is extremely important for any practitioner or academic. It's a demonstration of your intention and determination to best practices and continuous improvement. I finished my Bachelor of Electrical Engineering, which took me to that technical, heavy industrial environments, manufacturing, production lines, efficiency, processes, robotics, which was fascinating. And then I moved on from one industry to another, and I kept adding more credentials and certifications while I'm progressing. I did two masters, one in strategic planning and the other one in applied project management at the University of Adelaide. And now I'm completing my PhD in complex project management. In terms of credentials, I have 5 credentials from PMI, among many others, but these 5 are very special to my heart, which I think you already know by now. In terms of membership and professional affiliations, I enjoy a membership of a long list of professional communities and the societies and organizations. And the list is this list is not final. It will be updated from time to time with new affiliations to be added to the list or removed, depends on my depends on the situation or where I am in my career. But again, similar to professional credentials and professional development, being involved and affiliated with those global societies and organization is extremely valuable to your professional career. And for me, at least for me, it was. So that's briefly about me. Quickly, for those who haven't met me or seen my slides or my presentations before, what I want to talk today about is basically an update about my research in complex project governance. So what I will do is I'll start with where we are as practitioners and researchers in terms of complex projects and complex project governance. What do we agree on? What are the fundamentals? And then we'll highlight some of the complications that surrounds that consensus and those fundamental ideas. And then we move on to the concerns and the research questions and the methods, and finally some future research steps and course of action that we implemented so far. So let's bear with me while I take you through this journey. So start with the consensus. With what is a complex project? So when the late Stephen Hawking was asked last, and I think it was in year 2000, about the 21st century, he said, "I think the next century will be the century of complexity." And while Stephen Hawking was talking about other sort of complexity, not project complexity specifically, but what he said is basically can apply across the board when it comes to complexity. And when you look at Ashby's law or the law of requisite variety, Ashby said only variety can observe variety, which is very fascinating quote from my perspective, because you can only control a system that if you have the capability that matches the complexity of that system or that phenomena or that project or that anything that you wanna control, and that specific principle law is a main pillar in our understanding of complexity and how organizations learn and how we adapt to complex environments, etc. So we, as practitioners and researchers, we are on the same page in terms of the characteristics and the status we are operating in, or the environment projects operate in. We are operating in a highly complex and dynamic and changing environment, which is getting more complex by the time. And when it comes to projects, we managed to identify a few characteristics for projects that we all agree on, including the one that you see on the screen, which is basically taken from the International Centre of Complex Project Management, which is an Australian initiative for advancing complex project management in defence and other sectors. So when it comes to complex project, we look at characteristics like bounded planning. And bounded planning is a very important aspect of complex project, because previously in traditional projects or simple projects or even complicated projects, the principle was total planning, which means we only move on to execution when we have enough ideas and thoughts and details about the project. So the purpose of planning was basically to eliminate uncertainty or eliminate ambiguity or reduce complexity. When in complex project, we found ourselves limited in terms of how much we know about the project, how much details we have, and how much scope we can identify in advance. The other important aspect about complex project is the focus on impact, not the solution. So at the end of the day, when you, and I always mention the mental health services or mental health system, when you design a mental health system, your focus is on the impact, not the solution, not the tool itself. It's about the impact that you make on the society. Climate change, any project that addresses sustainability or climate change, the focus is on the impact, not the solution. So the mindset of bringing or creating an output or a solution at the end of the project is no longer one of the key success factors in complex projects. When you look at defense, when you look at exceed technology cycle, for example, when you look at defense projects might last for 10, 20 years, 25 years. By the time the project is halfway through, the technology that we use at the beginning will be expired or obsolete. So one of the key characteristics of complex project is that it exceeds the technology cycle. Another two important factor or characteristic of complex projects is uncertainty, ambiguity, and significant dynamic forces. When you look at, and this is something connected to that bounded planning aspect of a complex project, when you look at the amount of information you can identify in advance when it comes to complex projects, you find that the project team or the organization or the organizations involved in the project found themselves extremely limited and restricted in that domain. And this is also very important from understanding the structure of those complex projects. So when you look at dynamic forces, we basically look at factors that are impacting and the interdependencies that exist within this project. So any small changes within the project context can generate a cascading events or cascading impacts across multiple fronts in the project. So this is where we stand on in terms of what is what we know about complex project. We know it's we can plan limited. We are very limited in terms of our planning. The focus should be on the impact, the technology restrictions, or the technology life cycle. We know that we're going to deal with uncertainty and ambiguity, a large amount of uncertainty and ambiguity. We understand the significance of the dynamic forces, but we also know the importance and the value of project governance in that domain or in that context. So when you analyze the characteristics of complex projects, you find that project control is less important. It's more about making, so when you want to manage complex project, you want to make sure that this project is operating within certain boundaries, not controlled according to a certain baseline. And that's a very important shift in the mindset. And this is when project governance came into the scene and came into the conversation about how we can improve the outcomes or improve the efficiency or the impact of complex projects. So complex project governance, when you look at the literature or you look at the practice for project governance has multiple dimensions. But in complex projects, we understand that project governance has impact on multiple fronts, including the one you see on the screen, including the strategic alignment, decision-making, regulation of project behavior or the system behavior, organizational success, team cohesion, stakeholder engagement, communication, risk management, risk mitigation, decision-making, ethical compliance, etc. So we know the characteristics of complex project, and we understand what is the value of project governance in terms of regulating the behavior of a complex project. But if we understand the characteristics or the general characteristic or the shared characteristics, and we understand the value of complex project governance, so where's the problem? The problem is we know few characteristics of complex projects. Yes, that's 100% correct, but we don't necessarily understand the source of that complexity, where it's coming from, where it's mainly coming from. So when you look at the sources of complexity in any complex project, you will find multiple factors. So for example, this is just a summary of the research that we've done about the source of complexity, or where complexity is coming from in complex projects. And we made sure that we cover multiple type of projects or industries. In some research, it's about knowledge and system complexity, where in other, it's about stakeholder and legal and scope and project size. Variety, organizational, environmental, and technical challenges, descriptive and perceived the complexity is another factor. Human behavior, ambiguity, and system behavior, and this is PMI's approach for understanding complexity. And finally, structural, technical, directional, and temporal. So when you look at the source of complexity, if you want to clearly identify the source of complexity, you will find endless factors that can contribute to project complexity. And that's what makes the situation very complicated, because if the source of complexity is different based on the project or the industry, that means you need tailored approaches for project governance or project management or any project practice or project control. And another important aspect about these complications is where are we operating in terms of complexity? So which space do we really understand and clearly are all 100% confident that we are operating in a complex environment? So when you look at the Cynefin framework, which is a sense making framework, by the way, not a categorization framework or a model. The Cynefin framework or model divide the space or the project context or the context that we study or the problem situation, if you want to call it, into 5 different domains or areas. We start from the simple, moving on to complicated, complex, and chaotic, and finally disorder. One of the important things there are many important things about the Cynefin model, but one of the important things about the Cynefin model is the link between, or the barrier between simple and chaotic. And this is more like it's not actually a barrier, and this is when the sense making model name came from. It's not actually a barrier, it's more like a cliff, because there is no clear barrier between simple and chaotic. The other important thing about the Cynefin model, which is very relevant to my research, is the way we respond or the way we practice or implement solutions in a complex environment. So according to the model, in a complex society, in a complex environment, our first response is to test, to probe, to make an experiment, to run an experiment, and then sense the outcome of that experiment and then respond. When in comparison to chaotic or complicated, your first response is not to test. In chaotic, you want to act because you want to respond as soon as possible to prevent any dramatic or any catastrophic impact. When in complicated, when cause and effect are clear, relationship are clear, so you can definitely sense the impact of your solution straight away, and then they can apply them a methodology of analyzing and responding, etc. But in a complex environment, your first response is to probe, is to test, run an experiment, and then see the results and understand the results of this experiment, and then based on that, the results adapt to the outcomes that were generated. And that's very important to my research and the context in general, because since we are operating in a complex environment, we need to firstly to understand what can best work for this environment, and then we can generalize or we can move forward. Another important aspect about the Cynefin model is the disorder. And based on my understanding of the Cynefin model, I don't think disorder actually exists as an area or as a space within that model, but it's more about a status. When you think, and it can happen when you think we are operating, when the organization think that they're managing let's say a complicated project, but actually a complex project. So when you identify a project or a case or a system or a problem as something, but it's actually a completely different thing, this is when disorder will happen. And you might ask yourself at that time, if you find yourself in that situation, why the solution is not working, why traditional project management is not working, why WBS is not being effective, why project control and value management is not being effective. Because those methods are very useful for that complicated and simple environment, but it's when it comes to complex reality, it's not going to be effective for the reasons that I just mentioned. It's a very insightful model, a sense-making model, in case you are interested in understanding more about that model. Moving forward with the concerns, the other concern is but once we talked about the complications, we talked about the consensus. What we agree on, what's making this situation complex or complicated, and now what is the impact of all of this? What are the concerns? The concerns are basically project outcomes: waste of resources, not meeting budget, not meeting objectives, stakeholder dissatisfaction, conflict sometimes, wasting resources. That's bottom line. Project outcomes are not being met. That's basic project requirements are not being met, and that's a huge concern for project practitioners and academics at the same time. So despite what we know about project complexity, or complex projects and how we manage it, and complex project governance and governance in general, we're still facing a lot of concerns in terms of meeting strategic objectives, cost overrun, meeting deadlines, quality of deliverables, stakeholder satisfaction, to name a few. So what is basically the solution? So how are we going to how did we approach how did I approach this problem from my perspective? Understanding the importance and the value of complex project governance, I've followed a three-dimensional approach. Number one was about trying to understand how adaptive and innovative governance frameworks can help in addressing the challenges of complex projects. By saying this, I mean, I wanted to run the literature, examine the literature, and see how organizations and companies and those stakeholders involved in complex projects have managed to create a governance models or frameworks that could respond to the challenges that they faced. I want to understand from their experience, and this is what my systematic literature review was trying to address. And then when the other dimension, the other road was about complex projects as complex systems, which is the one in purple. In this domain, the principle is very basic. If we can agree that complex projects are complex systems, from my perspective, this is an extremely important finding, because once you are successful in identifying complex projects as complex systems, you can migrate to system thinking. And this is a whole new discipline and domain where there is a lot of tools and a lot of frameworks and a lot of theories that you can apply it on a project that we don't have in project management literature. And this is what takes me to the third one, which is complex system governance. So I'm going to highlight in my presentation today a little bit about some of the theories that are found in that system thinking domain, which can be applied to complex projects, under the assumption complex projects can be identified as complex systems. So one of the research that I found, I think one of the most insightful and fascinating reading that I've came across while examining the literature or reading about system thinking, is the work of Keating and Katina and Bradley between 2014 and 2022. So the researchers have identified 9 meta-system governance functions. In simple words, this research says in order for you to manage or govern a complex system, you need to have 9 functions tuned to the needs and requirements of that complex systems or complex project. Now remember, we're talking about complex systems now, but if we manage to identify a complex project as a complex system, then we can apply this to the complex project, which is fascinating as well. Starting from policy and identity, moving on to system context, strategic monitoring, system development, etc., ending with information and communications. Those are the 9 meta-system functions, governance functions that the researchers have identified. What basically caught my eye when I read this is that learning and transformation meta function or meta system, plus the information and communication. So how do we as an organization communicate, and learn from our mistakes. Now, from my perspective, this is extremely critical to any organization. Now, from someone else's perspective, they might find another meta system governance function more important or more relevant to them. But that's the beauty about this structure. I was fascinated by the ability how you can tune or adjust that learning and transformation meta system function and information and communication between different stakeholders to meet the needs of the project governance, assuming that that complex project is a complex system. So what I'm trying to do basically is, considering everything that I've briefly explained in the previous slides, I'm trying to answer 3 questions in my research. Number 1 is about, and keep in mind, it's about my approach to understand complex project governance. Number 1, I want to go back to experiences, the previous experiences, and this is where the slide that I talked about my approach should be in the background. So my first question is that on the systematic literature review, which is going to be answered by a systematic literature review, is to understand how did organizations who already been managing complex projects have identified or created or tailored or create from scratch maybe governance structures or models that can respond to the needs and complexity of their projects. And this is what I'm going to provide you with an update about in this presentation, and hopefully in the future I will keep updating this space with my findings. These questions are part of a research design that is based on a mixed methodology. So we start with a qualitative phase where we want to understand, do a literature review, speak to practitioners, understand their perception about complexity and complex project and governance, and then we want to support the findings with a quantitative phase, and then we're going to integrate the results at some stage. And come up with our governance model, which is based on the finding from both phases. So once we're done with the systematic literature review, we're going to move on to that qualitative phase. We want to understand how can system thinking provide a holistic governance structure that overcomes the limitations of traditional project governance models. And this is when I want to understand how system thinking can be beneficial. So in my mind, I will be able to find a mechanism where I can say a complex project is a complex system, and then I want to jump into system thinking and bridge these 2 concepts together and understand how can system thinking can help. And finally, using the findings from the qualitative and the quantitative methods, I want to develop a complex project governance model that can help and be tailored to the needs and expectations of stakeholders in a complex project environment. So the answer for the first question came through a systematic literature review, as I mentioned, which was a textbook style systematic literature review following the Prisma model, and the findings were extremely insightful and interesting. And actually reinforced our conception and our initial thoughts about the practice that stakeholders and organizations were implementing. So we found that in a highly regulated requirements or environment, the focus of any governance structure was on enhanced stakeholder engagement and transparency, so building trust. We found that high regulations or high regulatory requirements or compliance will enforce or will push for the need for high trust and better relationship between the stakeholders. So any governance model that has been established or implemented, the main focus of that governance model is to enhance that level of trust. Where when there is a huge different phases or different regulations or regulation changes or dynamic environment, we found that flexible and adaptive structure based on the project phase was the theme. So if, for example, if you're running a large-scale construction project, complex construction project, we found that governance structure at the beginning or at the initiation at the bidding phase is completely different than the one in the planning and the completely different one in execution. And that can also link to that enhanced stakeholder engagement and transparency, because in planning, we found that the focus is about building that relationship with the executors, with the organization that performing the project. Where in bidding process, it's more about achieving the best price for quality as much as possible. So different purpose and different structures. When we looked at environments when there is a high risk profile, we found that governance structures were aiming to implement an integrated risk management practices and promote resilience. So risk sharing and information sharing was very important between the stakeholders and the parties involved. And then we found another theme, which is a hybrid and multi-layered structure. So we found this was very interesting, because we found that even though project governance is an extension to corporate governance, so that doesn't mean that project governance cannot have their own independent structures, and they can. And we actually, organizations have managed to build multiple a governance structure with multiple layers, a mix between an formal and informal trust-based sort of governance, multi-layers. Each layer has specific needs and requirements and responsibilities. And then finally, we found an interesting theme about focus on ethics and accountability beyond compliance. So even though compliance was needed and essential, we found that ethics and accountability was more important in that space, and the governance structures and models were aiming to promote ethics and accountability. So the general themes, the three themes that I managed to identify were high interdependency and stakeholder diversity, correspond to trust-based relationship mechanisms and coordination across diverse group, where in an uncertain environment with high level of uncertainty and dynamic forces, we looked at adaptive and flexible multi-phase or multi-layers, different governance different governance structure based on different phase and different needs. And then when there is a high regulations and ethical constraints, we found that accountability and compliance and transparency are the focus, and governance must ensure and harness the legal standards and maintain public trust. So you can see that different environments and different contexts and different needs have actually demanded different functions for each of these governance models, which means that's 100% clear from our perspective, and which means that the way organizations respond, or the way adaptive and creative and innovative governance model respond to the unique needs and requirements of complex projects, is by adapting to the needs and by focusing on a different aspect compared to the traditional governance models. So there is actually a link between the need of complex projects and the way those governance models are adapted and structured. So based on these findings, we created a bonus outcome from our systematic literature review, which we haven't been thinking about when we started the systematic literature review. So we created a conceptual model to tailor governance models based on the needs of complex project. Even though the model is basic, but it is based on what we found in the literature and what we found in practice. So our approach for this conceptual model was basically as I said, based on systematic literature review. So we identified 4 layers within that conceptual model. Number 1 is complexity diagnostic layer, and from our perspective, this is extremely important. This is the starting point, which connect to the Kinevin model that I explained before. The biggest mistake in managing complexity is to identify the space can be done in identifying the wrong space you're operating in. We need a mechanism where we can identify complexity and agree on that definition of complexity, whether it's knowledge complexity, system complexity, environmental complexity, dynamic scope, etc. So the first layer from our perspective is complexity diagnostic layer. And then the second layer, which can also include assessing the capability of the organization in managing that complexity. So for example, if you identify complexity, if you apply that diagnostic mechanism or tool, and we've found that our organization or our project team cannot deal with that level of complexity, so that there is There is a gap that needs to be bridged before we even talk about managing that complex project. We can't manage what we can't manage. And then the second layer is about strategic alignment. And this is when I ensure that the project is aligned with the organizational goals and strategic objectives and stakeholder expectations. And this can be done very easily by applying basic strategic planning tool. The second layer is about adaptive governance layer, and this is very critical from our perspective. This is when the adaptation process takes place, and this is when the mechanism is tailored. So if you want to think about, go back to Keating, Katina, and Bradley's model, this is when the meta function system functions are tuned to meet the needs of the project governance. So in simple words, go back to the previous slide. This is when the focus is on transparency or accountability or regulations or ethics or something else depending on the need. And finally, we need the monitoring and controlling, not controlling in the sense of controlling, but it's more of a regulation layer. And this is when we need to facilitate continuous improvement, learning, a culture where people can actually make mistakes and learn from their mistakes and take those mistakes to the next level so they can prevent they can adapt to the needs and emerging needs of the projects. The next step in our project is basically to move on to the qualitative phase and followed by the quantitative phase, which I'm not going to speak about in a lot of details today. It's mainly because I want to save some contents for other videos, but mainly with the qualitative phase, we want to run some interviews and questionnaire to understand how practitioners perceive complexity and governance and transparency and the things that we found. What does it mean to have transparent relationship? What does it mean to have multiple layers in our governance model, etc. And once we have the findings, we want to validate the validation process for our conceptual model will be continued throughout the qualitative and the quantitative phase. So that's it for now. This is basically what I wanted to communicate and share with everyone interested. So if you have any thoughts or ideas or have any question or want to talk about it, please drop me a message or a comment or an email, and I'll be more than happy to address those questions. Thank you so much for being with us today. Cheers.